Everything changed when I lost my mom at 14 years old. I had to become a mother overnight. I had to work many jobs to provide the feeding, the school fees for my siblings, the house rent. It wasn't easy, but I had to do it because there was no other person to help. You have no idea what it means for you to be a child and also be a parent, because you know that there is nobody coming to save you. And I had to do all this because I was the first daughter of my family. I sacrificed everything to be what my family needed with no gratitude whatsoever. The moment I went for my NYSC camp, I just knew that everything had to change. I knew that I needed to stop fending for people and actually do what was best for me. And the moment I took this decision, you won't believe what happened. Everything turned around. Everyone blamed me.
At just 14 years old, Stephanie Okoro buried her childhood beside her mother's grave and became the only thing holding her broken family together. She never imagined that years later, a single journey to NYSC camp in Lagos would change her life forever and lead her into a love story powerful enough to challenge wealth, pride, and destiny itself. In a small, dusty village in Enugu, where the mornings began with the sound of crowing roosters and women pounding yam before sunrise, lived a young girl named Stephanie Okoro. But nobody really called her Stephanie. To the villagers, she was simply Ada, the first daughter. The child expected to carry strength on her shoulders even before she understood what life truly meant. Stephanie was born into a humble family of 6. Her father, Mr. Okoro, owned a tiny roadside provision shop made of old wood and rusted zinc. Inside the shop were hanging sachets of milk, biscuits stacked in faded cartons, bottles of soft drinks, sugar in transparent containers, and small household items carefully arranged to attract customers. The shop barely brought enough money to feed the family. Still, before tragedy struck, their home was filled with laughter. Her mother was a warm and hardworking woman who always sang while cooking. Every evening, the smell of soup and firewood filled the compound while Stephanie and her siblings sat outside listening to moonlight stories. Life was not rich, but it was peaceful. Everything changed the year Stephanie turned 14. Her mother fell sick suddenly. At first, they thought it was ordinary malaria. In the village, people were used to treating sickness with herbs and local medicine, but days turned into weeks, and her mother only became weaker. Stephanie still remembered the fear she felt each time she watched her mother struggle to stand. One night, rain poured heavily outside while thunder shook the sky. Her mother called Stephanie close and held her trembling hands. "Take care of your brothers and sister for me," she whispered weakly. Stephanie did not understand why her mother was speaking like that. "Mama, you will get well," she replied quickly, tears gathering in her eyes. But her mother only smiled sadly. The next morning, she died. The cry that escaped from Mr. Okoro's mouth that day was the kind of cry that could break a person's soul. Neighbors rushed into the compound. Women wailed loudly. Her younger siblings screamed in confusion. But Stephanie stood frozen. It felt like the world had suddenly become empty. That evening, while people filled the house offering condolences, Stephanie sat quietly beside the doorway staring into nothingness. She watched her little sister sleeping on the floor and her younger brothers crying softly beside each other. And for the first time in her life, she understood that childhood was over. After the burial, everything became difficult. Her father changed completely. He became quieter, older, and more withdrawn. Sometimes he sat for hours inside the provision shop without speaking to anyone. The burden of the house slowly fell on Stephanie. Every morning, she woke before everyone else. She swept the compound with an old broom, fetched water from the stream balanced carefully on her head, cooked breakfast, prepared her siblings for school, washed clothes, then hurried to school herself. At first, the stress almost broke her. There were mornings she walked to school feeling dizzy from hunger because she had given the little food available to her siblings. Sometimes she sat in class struggling to stay awake after spending most of the night caring for her little sister whenever she fell sick. But Stephanie refused to complain. She knew her father was trying. The little provision shop was no longer enough to sustain the family, especially with school fees, food, and hospital bills still hanging over them like dark clouds. So Stephanie decided to help. After school, she started doing menial jobs around the village. She washed clothes for wealthy families. She helped old women peel cassava. She worked on farms under the scorching Enugu sun. Sometimes she hawked groundnuts and sachet water along the roadside until late evening. The work was exhausting. Her palms became rough. Her school uniforms faded from too much washing. And sometimes cruel people mocked her. "See how life has turned her into a housewife at this age," some women whispered. "She behaves like an old woman," other girls laughed. Stephanie heard all of it, but she ignored them. While girls her age gathered under mango trees discussing boys and fashion, Stephanie hurried home every afternoon to cook dinner and help her siblings with homework. She stopped attending village dances, stopped playing games, stopped behaving like a teenager. People no longer saw her as a child. They saw her as a mother. Even her younger siblings began depending on her for everything. Her little sister Amara followed her around constantly like a shadow. Her brothers, Chinedu and Somto, listened to her more than they listened to their father. And though Stephanie loved them deeply, there were nights she cried silently when nobody was watching. Sometimes after everyone slept, she sat outside alone, beneath the moonlight. The village would be quiet except for the sound of crickets singing in the darkness. Those were the moments she allowed herself to feel pain. She missed her mother terribly. She missed being carefree. She missed laughing without worrying about tomorrow. But every morning she buried those emotions again and forced herself to stay strong. Because Ada was not allowed to break. Years passed slowly. Despite all the hardship, Stephanie remained one of the brightest students in school. Her teachers admired her discipline and intelligence. One afternoon, after class, her biology teacher stopped her. "Stephanie," the woman said softly, "you are special. Don't allow your circumstances to destroy your future." Those words stayed with her for a long time. From that day onward, Stephanie studied even harder. Most nights after finishing house chores, she used a small lantern to read her books because electricity in the village was unreliable. Mosquitoes buzzed around her ears. Sweat rolled down her face from the heat. Still, she continued reading. She dreamed of becoming successful enough to rescue her family from poverty. Whenever school fees became difficult, Stephanie doubled her efforts. She worked during holidays, saved every naira carefully, and somehow, through determination and grace, she finished secondary school with excellent grades. The day her WAEC result came out, her father cried openly. "You have your mother's strength," he told her emotionally. But Stephanie knew secondary school was only the beginning. University education seemed impossible financially. Still, she refused to give up. She applied for admission anyway. Months later, when the admission letter from the University of Nigeria arrived, Stephanie stared at it in shock. She had been admitted to study human anatomy. For several seconds, she could not breathe properly. Then she screamed. Her siblings ran into the room immediately. "What happened?" Amara asked fearfully. Stephanie burst into tears as she showed them the letter. Her father sat down heavily when he heard the news. Tears rolled down his cheeks silently. That night, for the first time in years, joy filled their small home again. Neighbors visited to congratulate them. Women prayed over Stephanie. Children danced around the compound excitedly. Everyone believed her success belonged to the entire village. Later that night, after everybody had left, her father called her outside. The moon shone brightly above them. "You have carried this family on your shoulders since you were a child," he said quietly. "No matter what happens in life, never stop believing that God sees your sacrifices. Stephanie held his hands tightly. Deep inside her heart, she prayed silently. Maybe life was finally about to change. Maybe all her suffering would someday mean something. And as the cool Enugu breeze touched her face that night, Stephanie had no idea that destiny was already preparing a future far bigger than anything she had ever imagined. The day Stephanie Okoro received her NYSC posting letter was one of the happiest and most emotional days her family had experienced in years, because after everything they had suffered together, it finally felt like life was opening a new door for her. She had just completed her studies at the University of Nigeria with a degree in human anatomy, and although the journey through university had been exhausting, painful, and financially draining, Stephanie had fought through every obstacle with the same determination that had carried her since the death of her mother. Throughout her years in university, she had continued doing small jobs just to survive and support her family back home. There were times she skipped meals so she could send money to her father. Sometimes she stayed awake all night reading with tired eyes after spending the day tutoring younger students for extra cash. Yet, through it all, she never failed a course, never lost focus, and never allowed hardship to destroy the dreams she had carried in her heart since she was 14 years old. So when she carefully opened the brown envelope containing her NYSC posting letter and saw the word Lagos boldly written across the paper, her heart began beating loudly inside her chest. Lagos. She had never been there before. In fact, Stephanie had never traveled outside Enugu in her entire life. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the paper in silence while different emotions rushed through her mind all at once. Fear, excitement, nervousness, hope. Her younger sister, Amara, who had been standing beside her, immediately grabbed her arm excitedly. "Ada, where were you posted?" she asked impatiently. Stephanie swallowed hard before answering softly. "Lagos." The scream Amara released immediately filled the entire house. Her brothers rushed into the room at once while their father nearly knocked over a stool, trying to stand up from where he had been sitting outside. "Lagos?" Chinedu repeated loudly in disbelief. Their father slowly collected the letter from Stephanie's hand and adjusted his glasses carefully as he read through it again and again, almost as if he could not believe what he was seeing. Then suddenly, his eyes became wet. Stephanie noticed immediately. Since the death of her mother, her father rarely showed emotion openly, but that evening, he looked at her with so much pride that it almost made her cry too. "You are truly going far in life, Ada," he whispered emotionally. "God will continue to reward your sacrifices." That night, the small compound was unusually lively. Neighbors came to congratulate her. Women prayed over her. Children gathered around asking endless questions about Lagos, as though Stephanie was already traveling to another country entirely. But later that night, after everybody had gone and the compound became quiet again, reality finally settled heavily inside Stephanie's chest. She was leaving home. For the first time in her life, she would be far away from her family. Far away from the siblings she had practically raised herself. Far away from the father who depended on her emotionally. The thought alone made her chest tighten painfully. She barely slept that night. Instead, she stayed awake arranging her few clothes inside an old traveling box while her siblings sat around her quietly. Amara suddenly burst into tears. "I don't want you to go," she cried softly. Stephanie immediately pulled her into a hug. "I'm not leaving forever," she whispered gently while stroking her hair. "I'm only going to serve, and after 1 year I'll come back." But deep inside her heart, Stephanie knew that life was already changing. And sometimes change came with distance. The morning of her journey arrived too quickly. The entire family woke before sunrise to prepare for her departure. Her father insisted on accompanying her to the motor park, despite Stephanie telling him repeatedly that she could go alone. When they finally arrived at the crowded park, Stephanie suddenly felt afraid. Buses were moving noisily. Conductors shouted destinations aggressively. Travelers dragged heavy bags across the dusty ground while horns blasted endlessly from different directions. Everything felt overwhelming. Her father noticed the nervousness in her eyes immediately. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me carefully, Ada," he said quietly. "You have survived things many people cannot survive. Lagos is only another chapter of your life. Never forget where you are coming from, and never let this world change your good heart. Stephanie nodded slowly, already struggling to hold back tears. Then, unexpectedly, her father began praying for her right there in the middle of the noisy motor park. He prayed for protection. He prayed for favor. He prayed that God would reward every sacrifice she had made since childhood. By the time he finished praying, Stephanie could no longer control her tears. Even her brothers were crying openly now. The goodbye was painful. As the bus finally drove out of the park, Stephanie looked through the window and watched her family standing there, waving at her until they slowly disappeared from sight. For several minutes, she cried silently. Not because she was weak, but because for the first time in many years, she realized how deeply connected she was to the people she had spent her entire life protecting. Hours later, when Stephanie finally entered Lagos, her eyes widened with amazement. Everything looked different from Enugu. The roads were wider. The buildings were taller. The traffic seemed endless. The city moved with a speed that almost frightened her. Still clutching her small handbag nervously, Stephanie eventually arrived at the NYSC orientation camp, where hundreds of Corps members were already arriving from different parts of the country. The environment was loud and energetic. Some people were laughing loudly. Others dragged boxes around while trying to locate their hostels. Military officials shouted instructions from different directions while buses continued arriving one after another. Stephanie stood quietly for a moment, feeling completely lost. Then suddenly, a cheerful female voice interrupted her thoughts. "Please, are you also looking for registration?" Stephanie turned immediately. Standing before her was a slim, light-skinned girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile. "Yes," Stephanie answered politely. The girl smiled warmly and stretched out her hand. "My name is Evelyn." Stephanie shook her hand gently. Stephanie. And somehow, from that very moment, something clicked naturally between them. Within hours, they were already helping each other carry bags, standing together during registration, and laughing like old friends who had known themselves for years. Evelyn was lively, talkative, and playful, completely different from Stephanie's quiet and reserved personality, yet they balanced each other perfectly. For the first time since arriving in Lagos, Stephanie finally felt less alone. What she did not know, however, was that someone else had already noticed her too. Among the thousands of Corps members moving around the camp that day was a tall young man named Collins Olamide. Quiet, calm, observant. Unlike many others in camp who were loud and desperate for attention, Collins mostly stayed to himself, carefully watching the people around him. And from the moment he saw Stephanie coordinating confused Corps members during registration while still remaining humble and respectful, something about her captured his attention immediately. He watched the way she spoke politely to everyone, the way she carried herself with discipline, the quiet strength in her eyes. There was something different about her. Something rare. As Collins stood silently from a distance watching Stephanie laugh softly at something Evelyn had said, he found himself unable to look away. And for the first time since returning to Nigeria from the United States, Collins Olamide became genuinely interested in someone. But Stephanie had no idea. Because hidden behind Collins' calm appearance was a secret powerful enough to change her entire life forever. The NYSC orientation camp in Lagos was always noisy from dawn until late at night, filled with the sounds of marching boots, shouting soldiers, excited Corps members, and loud music blasting from different corners of the campgrounds. But somehow, among all the chaos and movement around him, Collins Olamide remained unusually quiet. While many Corps members arrived at camp excited to experience freedom away from home, Collins arrived carrying an entirely different mindset. He had not even wanted to return to Nigeria at first. For most of his life, Collins had lived in the United States with his mother while studying medicine at one of the top universities abroad. He was intelligent, disciplined, and extremely focused, which was why he had graduated as the valedictorian of his class, making his family incredibly proud. But his father, Ambassador Ad Olamide, had bigger plans for him. The ambassador was one of the most influential politicians in Nigeria, and the owner of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. He had spent years building wealth, influence, and political connections, and now he wanted Collins to return home permanently and eventually take over both the company and the family's political legacy. At first, Collins resisted the idea. America had become his comfort zone. His life was there. His friends were there. Everything he knew was there. But his father remained firm. "You cannot run away from your roots forever," the ambassador had told him during one of their heated conversations over the phone. "Nigeria is your home, and one day everything I have built will belong to you." Eventually, Collins agreed to return. Still, there was one thing he insisted on. He wanted to experience Nigeria like an ordinary young man. Not as the son of a powerful politician. Not as the heir to a wealthy empire. Just Collins. That was why he refused to arrive at camp with security escorts or luxury convoys despite his father's objections. He ignored every attempt by his family to arrange special treatment for him and instead blended in quietly with the other corps members as though he were completely ordinary. And strangely, Collins loved it. For the first time in his life, people spoke to him without fear or hidden motives. Nobody cared about his surname. Nobody treated him differently because of his father's status. He felt free. Then he saw Stephanie Okoro. The very first day he noticed her was during registration, when confusion had completely taken over one section of the camp because several corps members could not understand the registration process properly. While many people complained impatiently and pushed each other aggressively, Stephanie calmly stepped forward and began helping people organize themselves. She moved from one person to another politely, giving directions and helping nervous corps members complete their forms without expecting anything in return. Collins noticed her immediately. Not because she was the loudest girl in camp. In fact, she was not loud at all. But there was something powerful about the calm confidence she carried naturally. Something genuine. Later that evening, Collins asked quietly about her from another corps member. "That girl?" the boy replied casually. "Her name is Stephanie. She's in Platoon 4. From that moment onward, Collins found himself paying attention to her constantly. And over the following days, Stephanie slowly became one of the most recognized faces in the entire camp. Every morning before sunrise, corps members gathered at the parade ground for drills and exercises. And while many people dragged their feet lazily or complained about the stress, Stephanie always arrived early looking neat, focused, and prepared. Her discipline quickly caught the attention of the camp officials. Before long, she was appointed one of the leaders in Platoon 4. And Stephanie handled the responsibility beautifully. She organized rehearsals, motivated lazy platoon members, encouraged people during competitions. Even when others were exhausted or frustrated, Stephanie somehow found a way to keep everyone together. "Come on, guys, we can do this," she would say confidently during rehearsals while clapping her hands encouragingly. "If we work together, Platoon 4 can win." And somehow people listened to her. Not because she was forceful, but because her determination inspired others naturally. Collins admired her more every single day. During parade rehearsals, he often found himself watching her secretly from across the field while pretending not to pay attention. Sometimes the hot Lagos sun would be unbearably harsh, causing many corps members to complain endlessly, but Stephanie never lost focus. Even when sweat rolled down her face and dust stained her white NYSC uniform, she still carried herself with grace and strength. There was one particular afternoon that stayed in Collins' mind deeply. The camp canteen was crowded as usual, filled with loud conversations, laughter, and the smell of rice and stew floating through the air. Stephanie sat quietly beside Evelyn, eating her food while discussing the next platoon activity. Then suddenly, one of the male corps members approached their table confidently. "Fine girl, you've been forming too much," the boy said jokingly. "At least give me your number." Evelyn laughed awkwardly. But Stephanie remained calm. "I'm not interested," she replied politely before continuing her meal. The boy's expression changed immediately. "So you think you're too good?" he snapped loudly, attracting attention from nearby tables. Several people turned to look. But Stephanie did not react emotionally. She simply raised her eyes slowly and looked at him calmly. "I just came here to serve my country peacefully," she answered quietly. "Please excuse me." Then she stood up and walked away gracefully without insulting him back. The entire canteen became quiet for a few seconds. Collins, who had witnessed everything from another corner of the room, felt something shift inside him deeply. Most girls in camp reacted aggressively whenever conflicts happened. Others constantly chased attention, expensive gifts, or relationships. But Stephanie was different. She carried herself with dignity even when provoked. And the more Collins observed her, the more fascinated he became. At night, while many Corps members sneaked out for parties, alcohol, and reckless fun, Stephanie usually stayed back in the hostel with Evelyn discussing life, family, and future dreams. Sometimes Collins overheard small pieces of her conversations accidentally. He learned that she came from a poor village in Enugu. He learned that she had practically raised her siblings after losing her mother. He learned that she had struggled through university alone. And suddenly, his admiration became something much deeper. One evening after platoon rehearsals, Collins sat quietly outside his hostel, staring at the dark sky, while several Corps members played music nearby. For the first time in years, his thoughts were completely occupied by one person: Stephanie. Not because of beauty alone, though she was undeniably beautiful in a simple and natural way, but because she possessed qualities he had never seen before. Strength, humility, discipline, kindness. Everything about her felt real, and that terrified him slightly, because Collins had promised himself long ago that he would never allow emotions to distract him from his future. Yet somehow, this quiet village girl from Enugu was slowly breaking down every wall around his heart without even trying. Meanwhile, Stephanie remained completely unaware of the storm she was creating inside him. To her, Collins was simply the quiet young man in Platoon 4 who rarely spoke too much and always seemed calm, no matter what was happening around him. Sometimes she noticed him watching her during activities, but she never thought deeply about it. After all, Stephanie had not come to NYSC camp looking for love. She came to complete her service year successfully and hopefully build a better future for herself and her family. Relationships were the last thing on her mind. But destiny had already begun writing a completely different story for both of them. And neither Stephanie nor Collins knew that the 3 weeks they were spending together in camp would soon change their lives forever. The final week of NYSC orientation camp in Lagos arrived faster than Stephanie expected, and although she was excited to finally leave the stressful camp environment behind, a strange sadness settled quietly inside her heart because she had grown used to the friendships, routines, and familiar faces around her. For the past 3 weeks, camp had become its own little world. Every morning began with loud whistles before sunrise. Every afternoon carried the exhaustion of parade rehearsals beneath the hot Lagos sun. And every evening ended with music, laughter, tired conversations, and Corps members slowly building friendships that felt deeper than the short amount of time they had known one another. Among the few people Stephanie had grown truly close to was Evelyn, whose cheerful personality constantly brought life into every situation, no matter how stressful things became. The two girls had become inseparable. They ate together, attended activities together. Even during late-night hostel conversations, they stayed awake, discussing family, dreams, and what kind of future they hoped to build after service. "You know something?" Evelyn said one evening while they folded their clothes inside the hostel. "I feel like Lagos is going to change our lives." Stephanie smiled softly. "I just pray for peace and a good place of primary assignment," she replied honestly. "That alone is enough for me." But unknown to Stephanie, someone else had already started making sure her prayer would become reality. Collins Olamide. The quiet young man from Platoon 4 had spent the last few days secretly making arrangements behind the scenes after discovering where Corps members would likely be posted. The moment he realized he might lose contact with Stephanie after camp ended, something inside him became restless. He was not ready for her to disappear from his life. Not yet. So after making one discreet phone call to his father's company, Collins quietly ensured that Stephanie's place of primary assignment would be at Olamide Pharmaceuticals, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Lagos, and the same company his father owned. Stephanie, of course, knew absolutely nothing about it. The day posting letters were finally distributed, tension filled the entire camp as corps members rushed anxiously to check their assignments. Some people screamed excitedly. Others complained loudly after being posted far away. Stephanie collected her own letter nervously before opening it carefully. The moment she saw the company name, her eyes widened in disbelief. Olamide Pharmaceuticals? Evelyn gasped after peeking at the paper. Stephanie, this company is huge. Stephanie could barely contain her excitement. She had heard about the company before during her university days because it was considered one of the most respected pharmaceutical organizations in Nigeria. The opportunity alone felt like a blessing. Meanwhile, standing a short distance away, Collins watched her smile quietly to herself, and for some reason, seeing her happy made him feel unexpectedly satisfied. A few days later, camp officially ended. The emotional atmosphere that morning was overwhelming, as corps members exchanged phone numbers, hugged one another tightly, and promised to stay in touch after leaving camp. Stephanie hugged Evelyn tightly when they discovered they had both been posted within Lagos. Thank God, Evelyn laughed excitedly. At least we won't lose each other. The two girls eventually left camp together and immediately began searching for accommodation close to their places of assignment. After several stressful days of house hunting beneath the unforgiving Lagos heat, they finally found a small but decent two-bedroom apartment in Victoria Island. The apartment was far from luxurious. The walls needed repainting. The kitchen cabinets were old, and the rooms were small. But to Stephanie, it felt perfect. For the first time in her life, she was living independently in a city she had once only heard about in stories. Using the little money she had saved from university alongside financial support from her father and contributions from Evelyn, they managed to furnish the apartment modestly. They bought a small mattress, a second-hand refrigerator, plastic chairs, simple kitchen utensils, nothing extravagant. But every item inside that apartment represented hope for a better future. The following Monday, Stephanie resumed officially at Olamide Pharmaceuticals. From the moment she stepped into the company building, she was amazed. The environment was elegant, modern, and organized in a way she had never experienced before. Employees moved around professionally. The reception area smelled fresh and expensive. Everything about the company reflected wealth and success. Stephanie adjusted her simple blouse nervously as she followed one of the supervisors around during orientation. She was introduced to different departments, shown where she would be assisting during her service year, and carefully instructed about company rules and expectations. Throughout the entire process, she remained attentive and eager to learn. The next morning, Stephanie arrived even earlier, and that was when she saw him. Collins. For a moment, she froze slightly in surprise. The quiet boy from Platoon 4 stood near one of the office corridors, speaking calmly with another employee. Stephanie blinked twice. What was he doing here? Before she could decide whether to greet him, Collins turned and noticed her too. A small smile appeared briefly on his face. Stephanie, he said calmly. She smiled politely. Collins, you work here too? Apparently, he replied lightly, making her laugh softly. That was all. No long conversation. No dramatic reunion. Both of them simply returned to work afterward. But from that day onward, everything slowly began changing between them. Stephanie soon discovered that Collins was surprisingly intelligent and extremely knowledgeable about almost everything happening inside the company. Whenever she struggled with certain tasks, he always found a way to guide her subtly without making her feel incapable. Sometimes he passed helpful advice casually during meetings. Other times, he explained difficult processes patiently whenever she seemed confused. And every single time she followed his suggestions, things worked out perfectly. Stephanie admired him deeply for that. Unlike many people in the office who constantly tried to impress others loudly, Collins remained humble and reserved, despite clearly being brilliant. Meanwhile, Collins continued admiring Stephanie quietly from closer now. He watched how hardworking she was, how respectful she remained toward everyone regardless of status, how seriously she approached every responsibility given to her. Even senior staff members quickly noticed her dedication. "She's different from most core members," one manager commented during a meeting one afternoon. "That girl has leadership qualities." Collins smiled silently to himself after hearing those words. He already knew. Weeks passed, and slowly, friendship bloomed naturally between them. After work sometimes, Collins offered to drop Stephanie home using his modest car, which Stephanie assumed was simply the vehicle of an average worker trying to survive Lagos traffic like everyone else. Their conversations during those drives became longer each day. They discussed family, dreams, childhood memories, life struggles. And somehow, talking to Collins always made Stephanie feel unusually comfortable. For the first time in years, she found herself laughing freely again without carrying the constant heaviness of responsibility on her shoulders. One Friday evening after work, Collins invited her to the cinema casually. Stephanie almost declined initially because she rarely spent money on entertainment, but Evelyn forced her to go. "You deserve to enjoy yourself for once," Evelyn insisted dramatically while pushing her toward the door. That night changed something quietly between them. After the movie, they walked slowly outside holding cups of ice cream while discussing funny scenes from the film and laughing so much that Stephanie's stomach hurt. For a moment, she forgot every painful thing life had ever put her through. And Collins noticed it. He noticed how beautiful her smile looked whenever she truly relaxed. Soon, their friendship became part of daily life. Some weekends, Stephanie invited him over for homemade meals at the apartment. Other weekends, he took her out quietly to peaceful places around Lagos where they could talk without distractions. Evelyn constantly teased Stephanie about him afterward. "That boy likes you," she said one evening confidently. Stephanie immediately denied it. But deep down, she already knew Evelyn was right. Because slowly, carefully, and without permission, Collins Olamide was finding his way into places inside her heart she had closed off years ago after losing her mother. And what frightened Stephanie most was that she was beginning to want him there. Yet, despite how close they had become, Collins still carried one dangerous secret silently behind every smile and every conversation. Stephanie believed he was simply another hard-working young man trying to build a future for himself. She had no idea that the man driving her home after work, the man eating noodles with her inside her tiny apartment, the man slowly becoming the center of her happiness, was actually the heir to the entire empire where they both worked. By the 4th month of her service year at Olamide Pharmaceuticals in Lagos, Stephanie Okoro had finally begun settling comfortably into her new life, and for the first time in many years, she could honestly admit to herself that she was happy. Not because life had suddenly become perfect, not because all her struggles had disappeared overnight, but because somewhere between long workdays, late evening conversations, shared laughter, and peaceful weekends spent with Collins, Stephanie had slowly started feeling lighter inside. Lagos no longer felt unfamiliar. The once overwhelming traffic had become normal. The tiny apartment she shared with Evelyn now truly felt like home. And Collins? Collins had quietly become the most important part of her daily life. It happened so naturally that Stephanie barely noticed when the friendship between them stopped feeling ordinary. At first, she simply enjoyed his company. Then she started looking forward to seeing him every morning at work. Soon, his voice became the calmest part of her day. Sometimes, while working, she caught herself smiling at random memories of their conversations, and each time it happened, she immediately tried to hide it from herself. Because Stephanie was not used to love. Life had never given her enough time to think about romance. Since the death of her mother, survival had always come first. But Collins made her feel safe in ways she could not explain. And though neither of them had officially confessed their feelings yet, the connection between them had already become impossible to ignore. One Saturday afternoon, Stephanie stood inside the kitchen preparing jollof rice while Collins sat at the dining table helping Evelyn peel plantains. Evelyn watched both of them carefully before shaking her head dramatically. "You two are becoming irritating," she complained jokingly. Stephanie laughed immediately. "What did we do again?" Evelyn pointed at them suspiciously. The way both of you look at each other is no longer ordinary friendship. Stephanie almost dropped the spoon she was holding. Collins chuckled softly while pretending not to react. But secretly, both of them knew Evelyn was right. That evening after dinner, Collins helped Stephanie wash the dishes while soft music played quietly from Evelyn's phone in the sitting room. For a brief moment, their hands touched accidentally beneath the running water. Stephanie froze instantly. So did Collins. The silence between them suddenly felt heavy, emotional, dangerously intimate. Collins looked at her quietly, his eyes softer than usual. And Stephanie's heart began beating uncontrollably inside her chest. But before either of them could say anything, Evelyn suddenly shouted from the sitting room, "Stephanie, your father is calling." Both of them stepped back immediately. The moment disappeared. Yet from that night onward, Stephanie could no longer deny the truth to herself. She was falling in love with Collins. Deeply. Completely. And honestly, it terrified her. Because happiness had never stayed long in her life before. Then came the day everything changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon at the company. The office environment had been unusually tense since morning because rumors were spreading that the company chairman was visiting unexpectedly. Stephanie paid little attention to the gossip initially because she had never met the chairman before, nor did she concern herself with company politics. She simply focused on completing her assignments like always. But around noon, sudden movement erupted across the office building. Senior staff members rushed around nervously. Managers adjusted their clothes hurriedly. Employees straightened their desks repeatedly. Then, luxury vehicles slowly entered the company premises one after another. Stephanie glanced outside curiously through the office glass. The atmosphere immediately changed completely. "Chairman is here," one employee whispered anxiously. Moments later, the elevator doors opened, and the entire office fell silent. A tall, older man dressed in an expensive navy blue suit stepped confidently into the building surrounded by aides and security personnel. The aura around him commanded instant respect. Stephanie recognized him immediately from television. Ambassador Ade Olamide, one of Nigeria's most influential politicians. The owner of Olamide Pharmaceuticals. Stephanie lowered her head respectfully alongside every other employee as he walked through the office inspecting different departments. Then suddenly, something happened that made her heart stop completely. The ambassador smiled warmly. Not at the managers, not at the senior executives, at Collins. "My son," the ambassador said proudly while placing a hand on Collins' shoulder. Stephanie froze instantly. Her mind went blank. For several seconds, she genuinely thought she had misunderstood what she heard. But then the ambassador continued speaking casually. "When are you finally going to stop hiding inside this company like an ordinary employee?" he asked jokingly. Several staff members laughed politely. Stephanie could barely breathe. Her eyes slowly turned toward Collins, who now looked visibly uncomfortable for the first time since she met him. And suddenly, every confusing thing started making sense. The way managers respected him quietly. The way he always knew important information before everyone else. The way problems somehow disappeared whenever he got involved. The realization hit Stephanie so hard emotionally that she felt physically sick. Collins was not an ordinary employee. He was the owner's son, the heir to the entire company, and worst of all, he had hidden it from her the entire time. Stephanie immediately stepped backward slowly before turning around and walking away from the office without saying a single word. Her chest burned painfully. Humiliation, confusion, betrayal, all the emotions crashed into her at once. By the time she reached the restroom, tears were already filling her eyes uncontrollably. She remembered every conversation they had shared, every moment she trusted him, every time she opened her heart slowly to him. And suddenly, all of it felt fake, manipulated, planned. When Collins finally found her outside the building later that evening, Stephanie refused to even look at him. "Stephanie, please listen to me," he said desperately. She laughed bitterly through tears. Listen to what exactly? She asked painfully. That the man I trusted has been lying to me from the beginning? I never meant to hurt you, Collins replied quickly. But you did, she interrupted immediately. You watched me open up to you while hiding something this important from me. Collins ran his hands through his hair frustratedly. I only wanted you to know me for who I truly am, he admitted honestly. Not because of my father or money. Stephanie stared at him in disbelief. So you decided to test me instead? She asked quietly. Collins's silence became her answer. And somehow that hurt even more. Then another painful realization struck her. You arranged my posting here too, didn't you? Collins hesitated briefly. Stephanie's eyes filled with tears again immediately. Oh my God, she whispered brokenly. So even getting this job was planned? It wasn't like that, Collins said quickly. I only wanted to keep seeing you after camp. But Stephanie no longer knew what to believe anymore. For the first time since meeting Collins, she felt small, foolish, used. That night, she cried endlessly inside the apartment while Evelyn tried comforting her quietly. Meanwhile, Collins could not sleep at all. For days, he apologized repeatedly. He called constantly, sent messages, visited the apartment, and every single time Stephanie ignored him. But despite her anger, something inside her still loved him painfully. Because deep down, she knew the feelings between them had been real. Eventually, after nearly 2 exhausting weeks, Stephanie finally agreed to meet him at a quiet restaurant near the beach. Collins looked terrible. He had lost weight noticeably. His eyes looked tired from stress and sleepless nights. The moment Stephanie sat down, he spoke immediately. I fell in love with you before you ever knew anything about me, he confessed quietly. Everything between us was real, Stephanie. Every laugh, every conversation, every feeling. Stephanie remained silent. Tears gathered slowly in her eyes again. I was afraid, Collins admitted honestly. I've spent my entire life wondering if people genuinely cared about me or just cared about my family name, but with you, everything felt real for the first time. Stephanie stared at him for a long moment. And slowly, painfully, her anger began softening. Not because he had lied, but because she finally understood why he did. By the time they left the restaurant that evening, the wall between them had finally started breaking again. And not long afterward, Collins officially asked Stephanie to be his girlfriend. This time with no secrets, no lies, no hidden identity. Stephanie said yes. But neither of them realized that the biggest battle of their love story had only just begun. For the first few weeks after Stephanie finally agreed to become Collins's girlfriend officially, life felt almost unreal to both of them, as though fate had finally decided to reward them after everything they had individually endured in life. Stephanie had never experienced love in such a gentle and intentional way before. Not once in her life had someone chosen her so openly, so carefully, and so wholeheartedly. Collins did not treat her like a temporary distraction or a secret relationship hidden in dark corners. Instead, he treated her with patience, respect, and a kind of emotional softness that slowly healed parts of Stephanie she did not even realize were broken. Every morning before work, he called to make sure she had eaten breakfast. Every evening after work, he insisted on driving her home despite the exhausting Lagos traffic. And during weekends, he spent most of his time at the apartment she shared with Evelyn, eating homemade meals, laughing at silly movies, and helping Stephanie forget the heavy responsibilities life had forced on her shoulders for so many years. For the first time since losing her mother, Stephanie finally felt like someone was taking care of her too. And honestly, it frightened her a little. Because happiness had always felt temporary in her life. Meanwhile, Collins had never felt more certain about anything before. The more time he spent with Stephanie, the more convinced he became that she was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Everything about her carried honesty and strength. She had suffered deeply, yet she remained kind. She had struggled financially, yet she remained humble. And despite all the pain life had thrown at her, she still loved people with her whole heart. To Collins, Stephanie represented peace, the kind of peace wealth had never been able to buy for him. Unfortunately, peace rarely survives untouched when powerful families become involved. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Collins had gone to visit his father at the family mansion after weeks of avoiding him due to work and his growing relationship with Stephanie. The massive mansion in Banana Island looked as intimidating as always, standing proudly behind tall gates with armed security stationed outside, like a fortress protecting royalty. Collins walked into the living room calmly, expecting an ordinary conversation. Instead, he found his father waiting for him with a cold expression on his face. Ambassador Aide Olamide sat quietly in his expensive leather chair while holding a glass of wine, and the moment Collins saw the look in his eyes, he immediately sensed trouble. "Sit down," the ambassador said firmly. Collins obeyed slowly. For several seconds, silence filled the room heavily. Then finally, the older man spoke. "I heard about the girl," he said calmly. Collins's jaw tightened immediately. "What girl?" His father scoffed lightly. "Do not insult my intelligence," he replied coldly. "The core member from Enugu you have been parading around Lagos." Collins remained silent. The ambassador leaned back slowly in his chair. "So it is true," he muttered with disappointment. "She's not just any girl," Collins replied carefully. "I love her." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Then suddenly, the ambassador laughed bitterly. "Love?" he repeated mockingly. "You want to throw away your future because of a poor village girl?" Collins's expression hardened instantly. "Do not speak about her like that." But his father ignored him completely. "Do you even understand who you are?" the ambassador continued angrily. "You are my only son, the heir to everything I have built. People are watching this family constantly, and you think I will allow you marry a nobody from some village simply because you claim to be in love?" Collins clenched his fists tightly. "Stephanie is not a nobody," he said firmly. But the ambassador only became more irritated. "She has no status," he snapped harshly. "No connections, no influential family. What exactly will people say when they ask who my son married?" Collins stared at his father in disbelief. For the first time in his life, he truly saw how deeply pride and social status controlled the older man's thinking. "You care more about what society thinks than your son's happiness," Collins said quietly. The ambassador stood up immediately. "And you are behaving like a foolish child," he thundered angrily. "I already have someone suitable for you to marry. Senator Adebayo's daughter has been raised properly and comes from a respected family. That is the kind of woman fit for this family." Collins stood up too. "I will never marry someone I do not love." The tension inside the room became unbearable instantly. For several seconds, father and son simply stared at each other stubbornly. Then the ambassador delivered the threat that changed everything. "If you continue this relationship," he said coldly, "you will lose everything." Collins frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what you think," his father replied harshly. "Your position in the company, your inheritance, your financial support, all of it disappears. I will cut you off completely." But instead of fear, something else rose inside Collins. Anger. Deep anger. Because for the first time in his life, someone was trying to control the most important thing in his heart. "You can take everything," Collins said firmly. "But I am not leaving Stephanie." The ambassador's face darkened with rage. "Then leave this house." And Collins did. That night, he drove aimlessly through Lagos for hours before finally arriving at Stephanie's apartment emotionally exhausted. The moment Stephanie saw his face, she immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked worriedly. Collins sat down quietly before telling her everything. Every insult, every threat, every warning from his father. As Stephanie listened silently, her chest tightened painfully. She had always known their different backgrounds might eventually become a problem, but hearing the reality aloud shattered her emotionally. And what hurt her most was realizing that Collins was now suffering because of her. Over the following weeks, the situation only became worse. The ambassador stopped answering Collins' calls completely. Senior executives at the company began treating Collins differently. Some people whispered behind his back openly. Others mocked Stephanie quietly within the office. The pressure became unbearable. Still, Collins refused to back down. "If loving you costs me everything, then so be it," he told Stephanie one evening while holding her hands tightly. But Stephanie could not ignore the pain anymore. Every time she looked at Collins, guilt consumed her. She remembered how hard his father had worked to build his empire. She remembered the future already planned for him. And slowly, fear began replacing happiness inside her heart. One rainy evening after work, Stephanie made the most painful decision of her life. Collins arrived at the apartment smiling softly, unaware of what was waiting for him. But the moment he entered, he noticed Stephanie's swollen eyes immediately. "Stephanie." She could barely look at him. "We need to stop this," she whispered painfully. Collins froze completely. "What?" Tears rolled down Stephanie's cheeks instantly. "I cannot continue watching you destroy your relationship with your family because of me," she cried softly. "You deserve your future, Collins." He stared at her in disbelief. "So that's it?" he asked brokenly. "You want to leave me because my father threatened me?" "I'm trying to protect you," she whispered emotionally. "No," Collins replied painfully. "You're abandoning me." Stephanie cried harder immediately. Because deep inside she knew he was right. But she also believed letting him go was the only way to save him. That night broke both of them completely. Collins left the apartment emotionally shattered. And afterward, everything about him changed. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, stopped going to work regularly. The once calm and disciplined young man slowly became empty inside. Weeks passed, yet nothing improved. The ambassador noticed it all. He watched his son move through life like someone carrying unbearable pain. Watched him sit silently for hours staring into space. Watched him lose interest in everything he once cared about. And slowly, guilt began creeping into the older man's heart. Because for the first time, he realized something terrifying. This was not ordinary attraction. This was real love. And his son was slowly dying without it. 3 weeks after Stephanie ended her relationship with Collins, life in Lagos no longer felt the same to either of them because, although the city remained loud, busy, and full of movement, both their hearts had become painfully empty. Stephanie tried desperately to convince herself that she had made the right decision. Every morning, she forced herself to wake up, prepare for work, and act like everything was normal. But deep inside, she felt as though she had ripped out a part of her own soul the night she asked Collins to leave her life. She missed him constantly. She missed his calm voice. She missed the way he looked at her like she mattered more than anything else in the world. She missed the peace she always felt whenever he was near her. But more than anything, Stephanie kept reminding herself why she had walked away. She believed she was protecting him. To her, Collins deserved a future free from family conflict and emotional pain, even if losing him completely destroyed her own happiness. Unfortunately, Collins was not healing the way she hoped he would. He was falling apart. The once focused and disciplined young man who had always carried himself with confidence now spent most of his days locked inside his room at the family mansion, barely speaking to anyone. He stopped attending important company meetings. He ignored phone calls from friends and relatives. Sometimes he stayed awake all night staring blankly through the large glass windows in his bedroom while replaying memories of Stephanie endlessly inside his mind. Even food no longer interested him. The house staff noticed the change immediately. So did his father. At first, Ambassador Aide Olamide convinced himself that his son simply needed time to recover from heartbreak, but as the weeks continued passing, fear slowly replaced his stubbornness. Because Collins was not behaving like a man recovering from an ordinary relationship. He was behaving like someone losing the will to live happily. One evening during dinner, the ambassador sat across from his son in silence while untouched food rested between them. Collins looked thinner now. His eyes carried exhaustion and sadness so deep that even speaking seemed difficult for him. The older man suddenly felt guilt pierce through his chest sharply. "Collins," he called softly. But Collins barely reacted. For several long seconds, silence filled the dining room heavily. Then finally, the ambassador asked the question he had avoided asking himself for weeks. "Do you truly love her that much?" Collins slowly raised his eyes toward his father, and the pain inside them shook the older man deeply. "She is the only woman I have ever loved," Collins answered quietly. No anger, no shouting, just truth. And somehow, that truth broke something inside the ambassador completely. That night, he could not sleep. For the first time in many years, he sat alone in his study, reflecting on his life and every decision he had made as both a politician and a father. He remembered how hard he had worked to build wealth and power. He remembered all the sacrifices he had made for his family. But suddenly, none of it seemed important anymore if his son remained miserable. And slowly, painfully, the ambassador realized something humbling. Stephanie had never been the problem. His pride was. The following morning, without informing Collins, the ambassador began searching for Stephanie. It was not difficult finding her. By afternoon, his driver pulled up quietly outside the modest apartment she shared with Evelyn. Stephanie was shocked when she opened the door and saw him standing there. For a brief moment, fear crossed her face. But the ambassador looked completely different from the intimidating man who once insulted her background. Today, he looked tired, almost broken. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Stephanie hesitated briefly before allowing him inside. Evelyn immediately excused herself respectfully, sensing the seriousness of the moment. The ambassador sat silently for several seconds before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said softly. Stephanie looked genuinely surprised. The powerful politician lowered his eyes briefly. "All my life, I have measured people based on status, wealth, and influence," he admitted honestly. "I spent so many years building power that I forgot what truly matters." Stephanie remained silent. Then slowly, the older man continued. "I hurt you," he confessed painfully. "I insulted your background and judged you without knowing your heart, and for that, I am deeply ashamed." Stephanie's chest tightened emotionally. Never in her life had she imagined hearing such words from someone like him. The ambassador's voice grew heavier. "But the greatest punishment," he whispered, "is watching my son slowly lose himself because he cannot live without you." Tears gathered slowly inside Stephanie's eyes. "I ended the relationship because I wanted peace between both of you," she said quietly. "And instead, you destroyed both yourselves," the ambassador replied softly. Silence filled the room again. Then suddenly something happened Stephanie never expected. The ambassador stood up slowly, and before Stephanie could react, the powerful man began lowering himself to his knees. Stephanie gasped immediately. "Sir, no!" she cried out quickly while rushing forward. But the older man's eyes were already wet with tears. "I am begging you," he said emotionally. "Please come back to my son." Stephanie's own tears spilled instantly. Seeing such a proud and respected man humble himself so completely shattered every remaining wall inside her heart. She immediately held his hands tightly before he could kneel fully. "Please don't do this," she whispered emotionally. The ambassador looked at her desperately. "I only want my son to live again." Stephanie closed her eyes briefly. And in that moment she realized something important. Walking away had not saved anyone. It had only created pain for everybody. By evening, Stephanie agreed to see Collins. The ambassador personally drove her to the mansion himself. Inside the house, Collins sat quietly in the living room looking emotionally exhausted when he suddenly heard footsteps approaching. At first, he barely paid attention. Then he looked up and froze completely. Stephanie stood there silently, tears already filling her eyes. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Collins looked like he could not even believe what he was seeing. Then slowly, he stood up. "Stephanie," he whispered. The moment she nodded, Collins crossed the room immediately and pulled her tightly into his arms. And just like that, every wall of pain between them collapsed completely. Stephanie burst into tears against his chest while Collins held her like someone terrified of losing her again. "I'm sorry," she cried softly. "No," Collins whispered emotionally while kissing her forehead repeatedly. Don't ever leave me again. That night changed everything. Weeks later, Collins officially proposed to Stephanie during a private dinner by the beach surrounded by candles and flowers. Stephanie cried the moment he brought out the ring. And of course, she said yes. Their wedding preparations quickly became one of the biggest conversations across Lagos society. The same village girl once considered unworthy by powerful people was now preparing to marry one of the most eligible men in the country. On the wedding day, Stephanie looked breathtaking in her white gown as she walked down the aisle with tears shining in her eyes. Evelyn stood proudly beside her as chief bridesmaid, smiling so widely that her cheeks hurt. Meanwhile, Stephanie's father could barely control his emotions. As he watched his daughter standing beside Collins before hundreds of guests, tears rolled freely down his face. The little girl who once sacrificed her childhood to raise her siblings had finally found happiness. After the wedding, the ambassador kept every promise he made. He gifted Collins and Stephanie a magnificent mansion in Lagos. He relocated Stephanie's entire family comfortably to the city. Her brothers were enrolled in some of the best private schools in Nigeria. Her younger sister received every opportunity Stephanie herself never had growing up. And most emotional of all, the ambassador built a massive shopping mall for Mr. Okoro, transforming him from a struggling village provision seller into a respected businessman. The day the mall officially opened, Mr. Okoro held Stephanie's hands tightly while tears filled his eyes once again. You were truly born to be our Ada, he said emotionally. God used your pain to prepare your greatness. Stephanie cried softly as she hugged him. Because suddenly, every painful memory from her childhood finally made sense. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every hardship, none of it had been wasted. Months later, Stephanie and Collins welcomed a beautiful baby girl into the world, and as Collins carried their daughter gently for the first time, Stephanie realized her life had become everything she once prayed for silently beneath lonely village moonlight years ago. And standing there surrounded by love, family, peace, and happiness, Stephanie finally understood something deeply. Sometimes the greatest rewards come after the hardest journeys. And for her, everything began during 3 unforgettable weeks at NYSC camp.
Stephanie sacrificed a lot for her family. She did everything she was expected to do and more. And we are so happy that at the tail end, she got to live a beautiful life. But the thing is, there are a lot of African daughters that are going through the same hardship. They have to become everything for their family, sometimes even forgetting about their own dreams and aspirations because of they are being called the name Ada or Ene just because they are the first daughters of their family. Sometimes the pressure becomes so much that they have to do certain things they are not even happy about because of the need to show that they are capable. This story is just telling us, especially the ladies, that you don't have to do all these things. For the fact that God blessed you to be the first daughter does not mean that you need to sacrifice yourself on a platter to please your family, who most times do not appreciate your sacrifices. So if there is any Ada out there, or if there is any Stephanie out there, you need to sit down and actually talk to yourself and tell yourself the truth. Because sometimes it will not end like Stephanie. My flowers, please review the story in the comment section. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you would do if you were Stephanie. I cannot wait to see you next time.